I hope that your love for the Bible is growing in this season. Today we're jumping in. We're in a series in Genesis. And last week we were at Cain and Abel, right? The very first two siblings, two brothers. One murders the other, premeditated murder. It's not a happy picture. And today we're jumping into the flood story, which is a whole bunch of different scriptures, right? So it's Genesis 6, basically all the way through Genesis 9. So we're not going to be able to read every single piece of it. I do encourage you to go and read through it. And it's got all these big, contrasts in it, right? On the one hand, it's a story that has some beautiful pieces in it. It's a story that is so fun that we paint it on, children's church walls, right? You got the rainbow and the animals 2 by 2. On the other hand, the story is very clear that every human being and every living thing that was not in the ark on the face of the earth dies. So really the story is a horrific disaster. Not only that, it's a horrific disaster that is because of an even more horrific disaster, the state of the world before the flood, the state of humanity and what's happening on the earth. And you also got these big contrasts, as we go into this text today, you got these big contrasts, the idea, even imagining this thing, a flood, worldwide flood, that goes higher than the mountains. We'll talk about exactly how high, because the text is very, very specific. It doesn't read like a myth at all. It's very specific, even how high the waters go. Even imagining that is quite hard to imagine, right? And of course, mainstream culture and mainstream science would say that there probably wasn't a flood like that, although there is lots of evidence that might be interpreted one way or another. And so there's all these big questions. So what we're going to do today is we're going to touch on, we're going to go through and look at some of the flood stories from around the world first. Then we're going to go through the key texts, and we're going to touch on some of the questions that these chapters in Genesis bring up. But it's actually very easy to get distracted in these chapters. It's easy to get distracted from what the main point of the text is. And that's what we're going to try and walk away with, because that's what's going to help us actually live our lives for God today and move into the future. Sound like a plan? Okay, so we're going to start out with this. I'm just going to show you some of the flood stories or flood myths from around the world. And these are cool. I love stuff like this. You may be aware that similar to what we did a few weeks ago with dragons and dinosaurs, there are stories from all over the world. It's not every single culture that exists, but it is the vast majority have flood stories. So who is aware that that's true, that there are flood stories all over the world? Okay, and who would be aware of this one? This is probably the most famous one. This is the Babylonian flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is one of the tablets it's actually written on. I love stuff like this. It's written on 10 tablets that were unearthed, somewhere in Babylon, somewhere in Samaria. So here's the key points from this text. And as we go through these stories, I'm going to go through a bunch of them and just highlight the key points. What I want you to notice is, if you know the story of Noah in the Bible, what's similar and what's different, because both of those are super important. Okay, I don't know how you say this name. Utnapishtim, he survives the flood in a cube. So it's like this ark, this boat that he's instructed to build, but it is like exactly a cube, which doesn't seem like it would do very well in a storm. He saves animals, he saves a bunch of animals, and he saves his relatives, and then he becomes immortal, like he can never die after that. So I don't know where he is now, but apparently he was immortal. Here's another one. So this is a Hindu flood story. The story of Manu. And this is, so here we're moving into India. So somewhat similar region of the world, but quite far away. So Manu is warned by a fish god. And there's different versions of the story. Sometimes it's a fish that's sent by a god. Other times it's a god that appears as a fish. And he builds a boat. He's warned that there's going to be a flood. He builds a boat and he ties it to a different fish. A fish that apparently has a horn on its head, and he ties the boat up, and then this giant fish guides his boat through the floodwaters. He comes to rest on a mountain, So you can see some pieces that are similar to the Bible here. Although that's one you would imagine a lot of flood stories would have, right? Because it's kind of logical, right? If there's a flood and then it begins to subside, you might come to rest on a mountain. He's alone, so he's by himself. He doesn't have anybody with him, so there's no way to repopulate the earth. And so he just comes out of his boat that he's got, and this woman just pops up out of the water. Like, he's super sad. I'm alone in the world. And then all of a sudden, a woman just swims up out of the water. He's really happy about that. Okay. Here's another one. This is interesting. This is a Chinese flood story. And, looking at this, I looked at this a little bit deeper than I have in the past. The Asian flood stories, they are all super, super complicated. And there's lots of them. So I want to tell the story, even just this one of the farmer and the thunder god, would probably take half an hour to tell the story. It's got all crazy details. But basically, a farmer imprisons the thunder god, and this is a depiction of the thunder god. And then the farmer's kids think the thunder god's super cool, so they let him go. And then the thunder god repays them by warning them that there's going to be a great flood and giving them a giant gourd, like a pumpkin, kind of, right? And I guess it must be huge because they actually climb inside of it. And then the most of the story, the actual length of the story, is all about how they repopulate the earth. And there's a whole bunch of different versions. Sometimes it's because it's a brother and a sister, right? So are they really going to have kids? So sometimes the brother and the sister do have kids in some versions. In other versions, they repopulate the story they repopulate the earth in a whole bunch of different and really weird ways. Okay, interesting. Now we're going the other way. So we went east. Now we're going west from Israel, from the Middle East. Now this is a Greek flood story. In this one, Zeus is angry with everyone, which I think was pretty much how Zeus was all the time. He tells two people to build an ark. Okay, that's similar. The ark, after the flood, the ark comes to rest on Mount Parnassus. I'm not actually sure where that is. I'd have to look that up. And the interesting part of this one is the way they repopulate the earth is by throwing rocks over their shoulders. Super weird, huh? The god Zeus tells them, hey, you don't have to just have a bunch of kids. That's too hard. Just go get some rocks and just chuck them over your shoulder while you're walking. And as they throw the rocks, those become people. And the earth is repopulated. So part of the point here is similarities and differences. You can see how there are some big similarities here, right? It's a god, the biggest God, who's angry with all the people of the world. He floods the world, kills everybody, and then the ark comes to rest on a mountain. But there's some really big differences, aren't there? Right? Like in the biblical flood story, it's a family with several married couples who repopulate the earth. That has some plausibility to it, right? That could actually happen. Throwing rocks over your shoulder, I've never seen a rock turn into a person. Okay, here's another one. This one is hilarious. So a Norse flood story, and this one is hilarious because it's so culturally specific. Another name for the Norse people, we might also refer to them as Vikings. Vikings maybe like to fight a little bit, right? They're pretty well known for that. So in this story, Odin and his brothers kill a giant, and the giant, his blood floods the whole earth. So it is a flood of the earth, just like the biblical flood, except it's blood. And Bergelmir and his wife, they build an ark to escape, and then they repopulate the earth. So interesting. Here's an Aztec flood story. In this one, the gods warn, I don't know if that's probably Note or something, Note and Nina. They're sealed inside a hollowed cypress tree. That's interesting because what did God tell Noah to build the ark out of? What did he tell Noah to build the ark out of? Gopher wood. Yeah, no one knows what gopher wood is. But there is a theory, probably the predominant theory is that gopher wood is a cypress tree. But it's only used there in the Bible, so we don't really know. But maybe a connection. All the people of the world are turned into fish instead of dying in this story. So it's kind of maybe better for Sunday school story. There's not as much death. They just become fish. And afterwards, the people who were in the ark, in the boat, they disobey even after the flood, and they're turned into dogs. That's an interesting connection. That, of course, doesn't happen directly in the Bible, but something a little bit similar happens. Noah and his family do some bad stuff after the ark. This one is actually First Nations, North American, and this is from a region in Ontario. And in this version of the story, there's a great spirit who's angry with humans, and he sends a flood. Very familiar. The hero who survives, Nenabozo, survives with animals on a raft, and he sends the animals down to get mud from the bottom of the ocean before the flood is completely subsided. And it's a little bit interesting because that part of the story sounds kind of similar to some of Noah's stuff, sending out the birds. He sends multiple animals to get something to show that there's still ground there. Really interesting. And then final one, just because this one is the cutest and the funniest. You ever heard this story? Tiddalik in the Australian Aboriginal flood story, there's a really big frog who's very thirsty, and he drinks up all the water in the world. And so there's no water. And so the animals try to get him to laugh, so he'll spit the water out. And it's the eel who finally succeeds, because eels are funny, right? And the eel makes him laugh, and he spits out all the water, but it causes this flood that floods the whole world. Crazy. So that one is pretty different, right? I guess the point here is a couple of things. Number one, look at how many different cultures in massively different parts of the world have flood stories. And look at how similar some of those pieces are. In almost all of them, it's the idea that people did bad stuff and God was angry and flooded the world. Almost all of them. But also notice how different they are. These did not come from people hearing the story of Noah and then just getting it wrong a little bit, right? Like that's really different. Odin and his brothers kill a giant and his blood floods the earth. It's remarkable how many stories there are of floods. All right. And finally, of course, this isn't a flood story, but Jesus talks about Noah and the ark at one point. And Jesus, he's the one, guys. Jesus came back to life from the dead. I believe there's very strong evidence that that really happened. If that's true, then he knows what happened. He knows what happened in history. And here's Jesus teaching and very clearly believes that Noah was a real person and the flood actually happened. It was in the days of Noah, as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. That's when he will return to the earth. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them away. That is how it will be again at the end, at the coming of the Son of Man. So you can see very clearly here that Jesus did not take the flood story as some sort of interesting myth that teaches us about life. He took it as Noah was this person who he actually knew. And Noah entered the ark. There was a flood that destroyed the entire world. So as we go into the text today, keep that in mind. You can have, I thought I had a point there. Jesus knew. You can put that in your, sorry, I did have a point, but I thought I had a written point for your notes. Jesus knew that the flood was real. There was a real flood. Okay, let's jump into the text. Like I said, we're going to hit on a few different parts of it and identify some key stuff here. And then I'll touch just a little bit on some of the weird stuff and the questions that come up here. Because like I said, there's a lot of parts of this text that are going to tend to our brains are going to want to get distracted from the main lessons. Okay, our brains are going to want to go, what's that about? Who are the Nephilim? That's weird. Let's talk about that for 3 hours. Or our brains are going to want to go, how high was the flood? How did it really happen? And our brains are going to want to get stuck there, whereas the Bible is trying to teach us something about life. That's very important. Okay, so here we go. Let's jump right into this first section. I'll entitle it Unanchored and Unhinged. Okay? Here's how it begins. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. So God limits human lifespan at this moment. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. I think that's an amazing job of translation for the New International Version. That's a powerful line. Every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth. His heart was deeply troubled. The Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race that I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. That's how bad it is. Okay, so we'll pause there and talk about it. Now you see what I mean. There's a dozen things in here we could spend the entire time talking about. What is going on at the beginning? The text pretty clearly seems to be saying that some sort of spiritual being referred to as the sons of God, went and had children with human women. That's what it seems to be saying. That's super weird. I mean, I don't know if you would agree with me, but I think that's super weird. I can't quite picture what that looked like. I can't quite figure out, are they angels? What's going on here? I do think that's what the text is saying. There are some attempts to get around this that are out there, but it seems to pretty clearly be saying that. A couple of verses later, it talks about the Nephilim, which it's not 100% clear if the Nephilim are the sons of God that are referred to here, or the descendants, the offspring. Probably the offspring. Okay, probably it's referring to these as the Nephilim are on the earth in those days and also afterward. This is a reference into actually the book of later on in the Pentateuch, in Exodus. You have, when the spies enter the land, some of the descendants of the Nephilim are still in Canaan, which also makes no sense. If you're getting lost and you don't know all these Bible stories, it's okay. We're not going to stay here too long. It also is really confusing, and I could get stuck there for a long time. How do the Nephilim survive the flood? I have no idea. But it seems like these people are some sort of superhuman or more powerful than most humans. It seems similar, actually, to some other, like Greek myths in some ways. Although this is not a myth. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. Okay, I'll pause there and just say what we can gather out of this, and I think part of the point of the text, is to give us a sense of how bad the world had become. And I think that even though there are some really good translations in this part of the text, there are also some that are a little bit misleading. Like you might gather out of this last line that the Nephilim are actually really amazing people in some way. But I don't think that's what the text is saying. In fact, I think one of the things the text is saying is that these Nephilim, whatever's happening here, this is really, really awful. You can see that from a couple of different things. First of all, he's about to talk about how bad the world has become, right? Every inclination of the human heart is only bad all the time. You can also see it because as soon as it happens, right, as soon as this starts happening, whatever's going on between the spiritual beings and human beings, God limits the lifespan of human beings in response to it. God's response to this happening, his first response is, you are not going to be able to live a long time. There has to be an end to human life because people are getting really, really awful. You know how when people, if somebody has kind of a bad mindset in life and they're focused on the wrong things, sometimes as they get older, they get grumpier and grumpier? What if they could just keep on living and keep on getting worse and worse? I think that's part of what's happening here in the text. Another thing you can see is that, right, they went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. This is not a marriage by mutual consent, is it? So there's a lot in actually these early chapters of Genesis that's euphemism. There's a lot of really horrible stuff that they kind of say in a nicer way so that it's not quite so glaring. But there's some bad, really bad stuff happening here. And I think when it says they're heroes of old, men of renown, I think what we can think of is like they are warlords. They are really awful destroyers of the world, maybe a little bit like the Vikings describe in some of their myths. I think that's one of the things we can grab out of this. And then, of course, it tells us very specifically how bad the world had become. The human race had become so awful that the Lord regretted that he had made human beings. We could get caught up there too, right? Didn't God know from before? Doesn't God know everything that's going to happen from before the beginning? The answer is yes. How can God regret something? We could get caught up talking about that for a long time. I think this is more like God is not saying he really wished he had never done this to begin with. But sometimes you let your children do things, if you are a parent, because you know that they need to learn and grow. And sometimes the results of that, giving your children freedom, can be really awful. And in the moment, it can feel like, oh, why did I ever... Even though you know that long term, it was the right move. And I think that's some of what's going on with God here. You can see the heart of the God who created the universe. He loves. He is a lot like us as well. We're like him. But we can think of it as he's like us in certain ways, in that he feels things. And when he sees wickedness on the earth, this is very, very upsetting to him. God is more upset by sin, by evil, than any human being is upset by it. His heart was deeply troubled. So he decides to wipe human beings from the face of the earth. We can think about what the human race is like at this point. So I'm going to say a couple of points you can write down from this section. Faith is an anchor, and without it, we get pulled into the storm. That's what's being set up here. So we saw with Cain and Abel, we saw with Adam and Eve, they failed to have faith, to trust God, right? And that took them a certain distance. Death entered the world. But things weren't as bad as they could possibly get. Their kids got even worse, right? One murders the other. And then Cain started a sort of a civilization, and we talked about last week, what were Cain's descendants like? They were really bad, right? Everything was based on power, right? Who can control the other person? There were really no governments at this time. Think about what it would be like if every human being related to every other human being by just who's stronger and who can kill the other, who can dominate. This is what the world was like. If we think of, and we can see faith, so Abel was trusting God, but Cain kills him. And as we go through the text more and more, Noah here is going to be described in a minute as a person of faith, a person who's actually walking with God. We'll talk about what that means. Without that, human life spirals into like a death cycle. We talked about this in our Romans series. I called it the free fall in that series, right? Human life just gets worse and worse. So one of the things we need to think about today is, what does faith actually do for an individual human being and for society and the world as a whole? Because it is the most important thing. We're going to see that as we go through. Without faith, life is a disaster. That's why this disaster comes, because everyone's trying to live life simply on their own terms without reference to God. And when that happens, especially if everyone does it, things turn into, just imagine some of the worst places in the world right now. Things turn into that or even worse when there is no faith. Without faith, the world actually becomes a disaster. So bad that it's better for God to kill everyone. This is actually an act of mercy by God. Sometimes life can become worse than death. Okay, let faith arise. So let's see what happens next in the text. This is what happens with Noah. This is the account of Noah and his family. Now, Noah was a righteous man, blameless among all the people of his time. This is a way that the ancient Israelites talked. It does not mean that Noah was sinless, as we will see. He was certainly not. In fact, Noah was not even, in some ways, maybe by our standards, or if we compare him certainly with the teaching of Jesus, was not even a good guy in some ways. But he was righteous and blameless. He was a man of God. And this is the key text, I think the key way of describing it that Genesis 6 uses. He walked faithfully with God. And this is a way that in Genesis, people who had faith are described with this phrase over and over again. They walked with God. Who was the first person to describe with this phrase? Enoch. Well, Adam. Adam is described. Adam walks with God literally, and then Enoch walks with God, and then Noah walks with God. We saw last week when things started to get really bad, human beings began to call on the name of the Lord. They begin to express faith. And so the way I'm going to describe this today is it's not really so much about what Noah did, although he did some good things. The good things that he did were mostly just when God told him to do something, he tried to do it. That's it. When God told him to do things, he tried to actually do it. Walking faithfully with God mostly means that Noah did not try to live on his own strength. He recognized that he could not succeed in life on his own. Life is not just, do I have skills and ability and power? And if I do, then everything's all good. He recognized that that was not true. And that had actually led to the whole world being a disaster area way before the flood came. Noah lived his life saying to God every day, basically, I know I can't do it on my own, help me. And that attitude is the vision of faith. It's the vision of faith. It's God's looking down at the world and he's saying, all these people are horrific. This guy is also bad, but he understands that he's not good enough and that he needs my help. I can work with that. If I have that, I can rebuild the whole world. This is the role of faith in our society today. We'll talk about this as we go on. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight. Once again, notice how often the text repeats this. The earth was corrupt in God's sight, rotten to the core, and full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on the earth had corrupted their ways. Could it repeat itself any more than it is? So God said to Noah, I have to end this. And I think that's the way we need to understand God's sentiment here. Remember how broken his heart was for the earth. I'm going to put an end to all of this. It's so bad. Look at what they're doing to each other. The earth is filled with violence because of them. Don't put your mind on this too much, but for a moment, imagine what violence might mean specifically. The earth is filled with that stuff. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. I've got to wipe it clean. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in it, coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how you are to build it. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Notice here, I've said to you guys a number of times that this text in Genesis is literal. There are parts that are unusual for a literal text, for sure. But it's not a symbolic of something else. Look at how specific the directions are here. This is the measurement they used, right? It's like meters or feet, right? It's not the same length. It's about 1.5 feet. Or I guess it's probably somewhere around 0.5 meter, a cubit. Make a roof for it, leaving below the roof an opening 1 cubit high all around. Put a door on the side of the ark. Make it lower. Make lower, middle, and upper decks inside the ark. Because I'm going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens. Every creature that has the breath of life in it, everything on earth will perish. Once again, notice the repetition. It's almost as if God knew some people would think later, okay, did the flood really kill everything on the earth? Well, let me repeat this for you. I think the text repeats it 6 times, something like that. The flood would destroy all life under the earth, everything that has breath on the face of the earth. In fact, everything on earth will perish. But I will establish my covenant with you, with Noah. You will enter the ark, you and your son and your wife and your son's wives with you. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. Again, you can imagine that God knew later on, people would say, did Noah really have all the animals in the ark? Was it really every different kind of creature? Did that actually happen? And here you see the text repeats in specific detail again and again. 2 of every kind of bird, every kind of animal, every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come with you to be kept alive. You are to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away as food for you and for them. It even shows Noah how he's going to care for the animals on the ark. This is nothing like a frog sucked up all the water and then spit it back out. It's nothing like that. It's describing how this will work when Noah, a real person, is on the ark. Noah did everything just as God commanded him. A couple things you can point down. Faith, we already talked about this quite a bit. Faith means walking with God. And I would encourage you to use that imagery in your mind, walking with God. How much do you, if you are a believer, how much do you think about God in your regular life? When you wake up in the morning, is that one of your first thought, or one of your first thoughts is, here I am with God, or hi God, or what's going on today, or what is today going to look like, or please help me? How often do you think about him? Do you recognize that he's there? Do you walk through life with him at your side? Psalm 16 says, because he is at my right hand, I will not be shaken. He's right there with me. Faith means walking with God. This is from Hebrews 11. We'll skip that for time, but check out Hebrews 11:6. Then, of course, the flood itself happens. I don't really have a lot of points in this section, but we need to make sure we look at it. The Lord said to Noah, go into the ark, you and your whole family. He tells Noah when to enter. In fact, he gives him a 1-week warning. He tells him way in advance, tells him to build the ark. Then he tells him, okay, it's 7 days now. 7 days you got left to get your family inside there and get sealed up. I found you righteous in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs. He repeats it again. 7. This is a little bit different instruction, but again, talking about specifically how the animals are going to be taken into the ark. This time we find out that certain animals, ceremonially clean animals, those who could be used for worship, there are actually 7 pairs of those animals in the ark, whereas all the other kinds just have 2. 7 pairs of every kind of bird, male and female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth. Again, it's almost like he knew. Some people would say, well, could the whole earth really be repopulated from just 1 pair of animals? Maybe some survived somewhere else. The text specifically says twice that they didn't. None survived anywhere else. 7 days from now, I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. I will wipe from the face of the earth every living creature. Repeats it again. And Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. Jumping forward a little bit, in the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day, on the 2nd month, on that day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. And rain fell on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. For 40 days, the flood kept coming on the earth. That means increasing. The waters increased. They lifted the ark high above the earth. To me, I don't know why, but that image is one of the most vivid in the whole text to me. Imagining just the darkness and chaos and death and the ark just rising and rising as the floodwaters rise. How high did they rise? The waters rose and increased greatly on the earth. That's an understatement. The ark floated on the surface of the water. They rose greatly on the earth. He repeats it to emphasize it. Let me tell you how high. All the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. What? In a few minutes, you know how the story ends. It's going to end on where's the ark going to come to rest? Mount Ararat. How high is Mount Ararat? Mount Ararat is 15,000 feet high, almost. You guys driving around the Lower Mainland, you see Mount Baker a lot, right? Ararat is 20% higher than Mount Baker. The text specifically says, I mean, really, it's talking about a worldwide flood. There's no other real possibility here if it covered Mount Ararat. It's saying that Mount Baker was covered by the flood. Ararat itself was covered to a depth of, it actually says, the waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits. How would he know? Noah must have actually had a line that was 15 cubits deep, and he tried to sound for the mountains, and he couldn't find them. He repeats over and over again. We got to move on for sake of time. There's so much in this text. Every living thing, every living thing. Look at how many times it comes. The waters flooded the earth for 150 days. There's so much specific detail in this account, far more than any of the other accounts, except for the Asian accounts of the flood myths. But those are very fun. They're very fun. They're not quite the same character as this one. The covenant with Noah. After he comes out of the ark, God makes a new agreement with Noah. We read this during the offering time. Noah builds an altar. He worships the Lord as the first thing after he comes out. And of course, God says never again is he going to curse the ground because of humans. Very interesting. Remember, we talked about last week, Cain could not grow crops anymore. But God has said now, no matter what we do, the ground is still going to produce food for us. Even if this happens again. Notice in this line here, there is a possibility left open that the earth could get as bad as it did again. Even if every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood, even if that happens again, God says, I'm still not going to destroy it like I've done. Not again. This, as long as the earth endures, he sort of establishes the seasons. I'm going to jump forward into the final section so we can wrap up today. The final section is very important because it shows us who Noah was. And Noah is our ancestor. He is. Just like Adam and Eve, real people who are our ancestors. Noah is faithful. He has that attitude we talked about. He wants to walk with God. He wants to say to God, hey, I know I can't do this on my own. I need your help. That's his attitude. But there's a reason that's his attitude. It's because Noah's totally dysfunctional, and his family is dysfunctional. And so when your family is dysfunctional, and when the world is chaos in our time, don't be surprised. Oh, that's from last week. That's not supposed to be there. All right, here's what happens. You guys might know the story. After he worships, he goes to church, his version of church, he worships God, and then he leaves there, he plants a vineyard, and he gets drunk. That's the next thing that happens. Noah, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. When he drank some of its wine, he became drunk, and he lay uncovered, naked, inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it across their shoulders. Then they walked in backwards and covered their father's naked body. Their faces were turned the other way, so they would not see their father naked. When Noah woke up from his wine with his hangover and found out what his youngest son had done to him, he cursed his youngest son. He cursed him. So you have a number of things in this text. We can't spend time going into depth, but there is euphemism in this text. It's not just that Noah was naked in his tent. There's more than that. And it's not just that Ham saw him naked. That is a Hebrew phrase that describes something bad that happened, really bad. And this is why Noah, when he comes to, curses his son. Right from the beginning, the new beginning, this is what the human race is like. But God says, in my grace, I'm going to make a way. Even if it's that bad, right from the start, if people will simply say to me, I want to follow you, please help me. I can't do it on my own. God looks down at us and says, I can use that. I can use you no matter how bad it is, I can use you if you just trust me and keep on asking me for help.